Part 1. A book born of fear, fire, and power. They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victor writes down everything? Not just the names of kings and the outcomes of battles, but pigs and plows, oxen and orchards, slaves and smithies, mills and meadows, every morsel of wealth in a land subdued by fire and blade, inscribed into a record so comprehensive and final that it came to be known, with a touch of dread, as the Domesday Book. Completed in 1086, this was no idle ledger. It was a staggering, systematic audit of England's economic life, drawn up with an unflinching eye and cold precision. Yet it did not emerge from a love of knowledge, nor from a bureaucratic impulse alone. It was born from bloodshed, suspicion, and the unrelenting will of one man to control the land he had fought so brutally to possess. When William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel in 1066, he came as a claimant to the English throne, but he stayed as a conqueror. The Battle of Hastings gave him a crown, but not a peaceful and obedient kingdom. Over the next 2 decades, William faced a fractured landscape, a patchwork of earldoms, each steeped in centuries of Anglo-Saxon and Danish custom, bound more by local loyalty than royal fiat. The resistance he encountered was tenacious, if not always coordinated. There were the Exeter Revolt in 1068, rebellions in the Midlands and Northumbria, uprisings in the Fens led by Hereward the Wake, and constant unrest in the Welsh marches. His response was often swift and merciless. The infamous harrying of the North in 1069 and 1070 stands out as a campaign of extraordinary brutality. In retaliation for Anglo-Danish resistance, William ordered the systematic destruction of farmland, villages, and livestock across Yorkshire and Durham. Chroniclers described a wasteland of famine and death. Nowhere else had cruelty been carried to such extremes, wrote Orderic Vitalis. Whole regions were depopulated, fields salted, and livelihoods extinguished. The aim was not only to suppress revolt, but to ensure no rebellion could be sustained again. Yet even when the sword brought silence, it could not guarantee order. England remained a volatile possession. Norman lords who had carved out vast estates from the spoils of conquest often behaved like petty kings in their own right. They fought amongst themselves, seized lands not legally granted to them, and exploited the confusion of post-conquest inheritance. William, constantly shuttling between Normandy and England, grew increasingly distrustful, not only of the English population, but of his own barons. He feared they were concealing the true extent of their wealth and underreporting their obligations, and were even plotting to overthrow him. The realm he had won was vast, but its grip was still contested, even by those who had his favor. William's priorities were divided. His deepest loyalties remained with Normandy, the duchy he had ruled since childhood, defended with blood, and turned into a springboard for empire. In many ways, England was his treasury, a land to fund his continental ambitions. But if it were to serve that purpose, it had to be counted, measured, and made transparent. William needed to know exactly what he owned and what others claimed. How many hides of land? How many taxable units? What rents and rights had changed hands since the death of King Edward the Confessor? The Anglo-Saxon geld, or a land tax dating back to the 10th century, had been collected regularly under Edward and his predecessors. But it was inconsistently assessed, often based on outdated valuations and vulnerable to manipulation. Local sheriffs and ecclesiastical landlords could conceal income or shift boundaries. William had no patience for such ambiguity. What he wanted was total clarity, a master record that would leave no room for evasion. In 1085, however, another force accelerated his ambitions. William returned to England to collect the land tax in order to confront an imminent invasion threat from King Canute IV of Denmark. This Danish threat was serious. Canute IV had forged alliances with neighboring Flanders and Norway and gathered a large fleet aimed at England. To fund the defensive measures needed in 1085, William levied a heavy danegeld, or a tax, for defense, and he may have come to England specifically to oversee its collection. With English and Norman forces on high alert throughout 1085, William held a council at Gloucester at Christmas 1085, and, amid these military preparations, took an unprecedented step. He ordered a comprehensive survey of his kingdom's resources and wealth. This survey, which would later be known as the Domesday Book, was born in a climate of fear and urgency, and executed in an astonishingly short time, partly because William urgently needed to assess and maximize the wealth he could draw on to defend his realms, partly because of his desire to establish even more control over lands and landowners in England who might challenge his rule. Part 2. Why the Domesday Book was possible: infrastructure, precedents, and vision. Thus was born the Domesday Inquest, a project so vast in scope and revolutionary in execution that it defied comparison in the medieval world. William did not merely wish to know, he wished to control. And to control, he had to enumerate. In December 1085, the order went out at the Christmas court in Gloucester. The entire kingdom was to be surveyed, manor by manor, village by village, with every acre, every ox, every human soul accounted for. William's decision to launch a kingdom-wide survey was as bold as it was logical, and it was made possible not only by fear and authority, but by the infrastructure that predated him. Unlike many other medieval kingdoms, England already possessed the administrative bones needed for such an endeavor. What William envisioned was radical in scale, but not impossible in execution. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom he had conquered was surprisingly advanced in governance. Centuries of monarchs, particularly Ethelred, Canute, and Edward the Confessor, had developed a centralized system of local administration, built around shires and hundreds, with regular courts, land charters, and an active land tax system known as the Geld. Villagers were accustomed to recording dues, taxes, and tithes, reeves were appointed to manage estates, legal norms were codified in charters and writs, and legal disputes were routinely documented. There existed standardized units of measurement, landholding, and fiscal assessment. Though prone to abuse and uneven application, this system gave William a framework he could seize and reshape. William did not dismantle this machinery. He adapted and perfected it. In this sense, Domesday was not a rejection of Anglo-Saxon governance, but its ultimate appropriation by a conquering regime. Equally critical was the abundance of literate clerics and trained scribes. The English Church, especially under Archbishop Lanfranc's reforms, was well equipped to produce capable administrators who could write, count, and compile records in Latin, the lingua franca of governance and law. Many of the officials William entrusted with the Domesday Inquest were ecclesiastics, bishops, abbots, and archdeacons familiar with property law, charter rolls, and judicial process. These men formed the logistical backbone of the entire operation. Moreover, there were precedents, modest by comparison, but enough to give William confidence. Previous English kings had conducted land surveys for tax purposes, albeit on a smaller scale. William had also observed the record-keeping traditions of Normandy, and his chancellery had been shaped by Carolingian models from across the Channel. These experiences offered proof that centralized record-keeping could be wielded as a tool of royal power. William's decision to launch such a sweeping survey was not drawn entirely from thin air. Educated members of his court, clerics trained in Latin, schooled in scripture and classical texts, would have been familiar with ancient models. The Roman census, held every 5 years during the Republic and early Empire, had catalogued land, property, and people to determine taxation and military obligations. The very word census derives from censere, to assess. And the Bible, so central to medieval worldview, offered its own precedents. Both the Gospel of Luke and the Old Testament speak of divine censuses, one benign, the other catastrophic. To medieval minds, counting people could seem godly or perilous. More recent, though far less comprehensive, Examples also existed. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne had experimented with local record-keeping and had dispatched royal emissaries, the Missi Dominici, to monitor the provinces. But their efforts were limited in scope, irregular in execution, and heavily dependent on the cooperation of local bishops and counts. No ruler had ever attempted a unified, kingdom-wide survey on the scale of what Domesday would become. Part 3. The implementation, speed, precision, and legacy. What unfolded in 1086 was nothing short of astonishing, a feat of medieval administration so swift and exacting that it remains unmatched in scope until the advent of modern bureaucracies. Within the span of 8 months from commissioning the survey in December 1085 up to the completion of the Great Domesday Book in August 1086, William's agents collected data from over 13,000 settlements across England. While this urgency can be attributed to the potential invasion on the horizon, with William needing the kingdom's taxable wealth to be accessible immediately to raise funds for troops, the scope and the pace of the project are remarkable. No kingdom in Europe had ever attempted anything of this magnitude, and no one would again for nearly 800 years. To carry out this audacious task, England was divided into 7 geographic circuits. Each was assigned a small team of 3 to 4 royal commissioners. These officials did not trudge from village to village. Instead, they convened in the established shire and 100 courts, summoning local juries, typically 12 men per 100, balanced evenly between Normans and English, to provide sworn testimony under oath. Their answers would be cross-verified, challenged, and recorded with remarkable consistency. The survey followed a standardized, exhaustive questionnaire. Surviving documents show the commissioners asked, "What is the name of the manor? Who held it in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many hides? How many plough teams? How many villagers, freemen, slaves, cottagers? What resources? Woodland, meadow, pasture, mills, fisheries, churches? What is the estate's value in 1066, in 1070, and now?" Every variable that could influence productivity, taxation, and feudal obligation was accounted for. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle marveled, not one ox, cow, or pig was left out. If we divide the approximately 13,418 surveyed locations by the 7 circuits, each team was responsible for nearly 1,900 settlements. Given the likely 6 to 8 month window of active surveying, this meant processing over 10 settlements per day. Commissioners relied on pre-assembled juries and convened testimony in centralized locations. Speed was essential. A village might receive only a few hours' attention, and multiple nearby holdings could be assessed in a single day. Despite this breakneck pace, the accuracy of the Domesday Survey is remarkable. It was designed with layers of verification and cross-checking. First, the jurors swore their answers under oath, often on religious relics, making false testimony a grave offense. The mixed composition of each jury, half English, half Norman, ensured that no single faction could dominate the record. Secondly, these were not passive inquiries. They had an adversarial edge. Landholders were summoned to listen and could contest claims. Disputes were recorded in the margins. Neighbors and rivals could speak up. In a public courtroom, attempts to exaggerate or conceal wealth could be quickly exposed. Lastly, references to earlier records were consulted. The commissioners had access to pre-conquest tax rolls, estate charters, and geld assessments from King Edward's reign. If a manor was taxed for 10 hides in 1066, but now claimed only 5, the inconsistency would be noted and often challenged. The logistical structure of the survey also lent itself to credibility. Local reeves were expected to know the details of their territories and were held accountable for dishonest or inaccurate reports. Scribes wrote in real time, and once the raw materials were collected, they were compiled into regional summaries and ultimately into the 2 great volumes we know today, Great Domesday and Little Domesday. The survey's nickname, Domesday, a medieval spelling of Domesday, was not used at the time of its creation, but emerged by the late 12th century. The analogy was obvious to contemporaries. Just as Domesday brought eternal judgment, the Domesday Book's entries were final and unalterable. Land disputes might persist for generations, but the Domesday verdict became the default legal reference. No appeal, no revision. Such was the power of the written word when backed by conquest. This immense project was compiled in abbreviated medieval Latin, the language of power and law, written on vellum parchment by a remarkably small number of scribes. Great Domesday, the main volume, covers the majority of counties and is written almost entirely in a single, uniform hand, a feat suggesting not only bureaucratic precision, but the work of a highly trained royal scribe working under centralized supervision. Little Domesday, the second volume, covers Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk in a more verbose, unedited form. These were likely the first returns submitted, but for reasons still debated, possibly William's death in 1087 or time constraints, they were never condensed into the standardized format used elsewhere. Together, the two volumes comprise 413 pages of dense, abbreviated script. Standard abbreviations were used throughout, such as Tri-E to denote Tempore Regis Edwardi, or in the time of King Edward, and these notations became the bureaucratic shorthand of Norman governance. Once completed, the manuscript was stored in the royal treasury at Winchester, known at the time as the Liber de Wintonia, or Book of Winchester. Today it rests in the National Archives at Kew, the oldest continuous public record in England, and arguably the most famous administrative document in medieval Europe. The result was a document of unparalleled authority. For centuries, Domesday was treated not merely as a tax ledger, but as the definitive judgment on landholding, so final in its conclusions that it was likened to the last judgment itself. Monarchs and legal clerks cited it for land disputes well into the 13th and 14th centuries. It was not merely trusted, it was rarely questioned. This reliability, achieved despite haste and complexity, underscores William's genius. While the survey trusted local witnesses, that trust was anchored in public accountability, cross-verification, and pre-existing administrative records. The blending of Norman procedural rigor with Anglo-Saxon frameworks created a hybrid machine for truth-gathering, functional, authoritative, and enduring. Yet perhaps the most telling legacy of Domesday is its singularity. No English monarch ever attempted another survey of this scale in the medieval period. The 100 Rolls of Edward I in 1279 came close, aiming to update feudal rights and holdings, but it was partial and lacked the totality and urgency of its predecessor. In the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, a census was taken in 1183 to prepare for war against Saladin, but again it was narrow in scope. Even the famed Catalogus Baronum, compiled around 1100 in Norman-ruled Italy, only catalogued feudal obligations. None matched Domesday's breadth or depth. That it was never repeated, that it stood alone for 8 centuries, is perhaps the greatest tribute to its completeness. Domesday was only possible under William. Only his combination of conquest, centralization, fear, ecclesiastical literacy, and administrative clarity could compel an entire kingdom to lay itself bare on parchment. In a moment suspended between war and peace, tyranny and order, William counted everything. And in doing so, he created a record that defied the corruption, chaos, and forgetfulness of the age. The Domesday Book was not merely a product of power, it was an instrument of it, a reckoning disguised as a record. Part 4. Results and Statistics. A Kingdom Measured and Reborn. By the time the Domesday Survey concluded in 1086, England had become the most meticulously documented kingdom in Europe, perhaps in the world. What had begun as a royal inquiry into taxation and feudal obligations had ended in a complete statistical snapshot of the land, its people, and its power. Over 13,000 individual places, towns, villages, hamlets, and manors were recorded across most of the kingdom. London and Winchester were notably excluded, likely due to their unique administrative arrangements, but nearly all other regions were swept into the king's vast accounting net. Each entry focused not on a generic locality, but on a manor, an estate, often encompassing a village held by a specific lord. The data was granular. Who held the manor in 1066? Who held it in 1086? How many hides of land? How many peasant households? How many ox teams, pigs, sheep, ploughs, mills, meadows, and fish ponds? The survey showed that England remained a rich and well-developed agricultural country in 1066 as well as in 1085. It lists 13,418 surveyed locations across the land, 6,000 mills, and 650,000 oxen. There were 109,000 productive people, or free adult men, recorded, and 28,000 slaves. The amount of agricultural land was the same as in the 1900s, and the forests were already reduced to 20th century levels. Even ecclesiastical estates were listed individually. The church's lands, while sometimes grouped under great abbeys or bishoprics, were still enumerated manor by manor. The system recorded not just who ruled each domain, but what each was worth in wealth, labor, and obligation. It was a kingdom measured in cows, plowshares, and souls. The Domesday Book doesn't merely reflect administrative precision. It also exposes the seismic shifts in English society following the Norman Conquest, shifts best captured through numbers. While before the invasion, the Anglo-Saxons were ruled largely by consent between the king, Witan, and the people. After 1066, it became the rule of force. All lands now belonged to the crown, and all now owed allegiance to the king. By 1086, the church held approximately 26% of all land in England. Despite the conquest, most ecclesiastical institutions retained their holdings. Domesday lists about 300 bishops and abbots among the 1,100 tenants-in-chief, a reflection of the church's enduring power, though now firmly aligned with the Norman state. These lands, while subject to feudal obligation, were managed independently, often tax-exempt, and recorded under their respective clerical holders, such as land of the Archbishop of Canterbury. They were not folded into the king's domain, but they were watched, measured, and written down. The king himself, however, was the largest landholder of all. Roughly 17% of England was retained by William as royal domain. These included the ancient crown lands and the vast estates confiscated from rebellious nobles. Unlike earlier Anglo-Saxon kings, who relied heavily on the goodwill and support of regional magnates, William built his realm on direct possession. By keeping nearly a fifth of England in his personal control, he ensured that no one, not even his most powerful barons, could match him in wealth or strategic position. The remaining 57% of the land was granted to secular lords, overwhelmingly Norman. These were William's reward to those who had followed him from Normandy, fought at Hastings, or supported his rule during the early years of resistance. Among the tenants-in-chief, only a handful were English. In fact, land that had been held by over 2,000 Anglo-Saxon lords in 1066 was now concentrated in the hands of roughly 200 Norman barons. This is not hyperbole, it is statistical reality. One analysis estimates that only 5% of land was held by native Englishmen in 1086, usually small single-manor holdings, remnants granted to collaborators, or overlooked survivors of the old elite. The upper classes of Anglo-Saxon England had been obliterated, executed, exiled, or stripped of title. Their manors were divided among the new ruling class, men with names like de Warenne, de Mortain, and de Grandmesnil, whose holdings now spanned multiple counties, forming a pan-national aristocracy loyal to the king. Within that 57%, a small inner circle of 150 to 200 top barons held most of the land. These were William's chief lieutenants, magnates whose castles, retinues, and marriages formed the backbone of the new political order. Beneath them were hundreds of lesser knights and officials, each granted a manor or two. The old feudal web had been rewoven in Norman thread. This pattern of ownership, a king at the top, a compact clerical estate, and a loyal noble elite, would define English politics for centuries to come. The Domesday Book did not just reflect this order, it cemented it. But the statistics alone miss the Domesday Book's darker brilliance, its psychological weight. The survey was not just a financial instrument, it was a warning. It declared in ink and in public that nothing escaped the king's notice. No manor was too small, no claim too obscure. Even the church, even the richest barons, all were counted. All were answerable. When the Domesday Book compared the value of a manor in the time of King Edward and now, it did more than record depreciation or recovery. It asserted continuity. William was not just a foreign conqueror, he was the lawful heir to Edward the Confessor's rights, and he would enforce them with a precision and reach that no English king had ever wielded. And when William kept 17% of the land for himself, he was doing something radical. In a Europe where kings typically relied on barons who held land independently, William made the crown itself the primary landowner. It was a bold step toward centralized monarchy, centuries ahead of its time. The Domesday Book, then, was more than a survey. It was an act of statecraft, a weapon, a mirror, a monument, a document that captured not only what England was in 1086, but what it would become. Part 5. Impact on taxation and military recruitment, a mechanism of fiscal and feudal control. The most immediate and tangible legacy of the Domesday Book was its transformation of taxation into a standardized and enforceable institution. No longer did royal officials have to rely on out-of-date ledgers, oral traditions, or the goodwill of local lords. With this survey, William the Conqueror acquired a granular fiscal map of his kingdom, detailing the economic value and productive assets of every estate, from its arable land and mills to the livestock and peasants it sustained. This allowed for a precise recalibration of the geld, the traditional land tax inherited from Anglo-Saxon England. Previously, tax assessments could be arbitrary or unevenly applied, leaving ample room for underreporting and local corruption. Now, with the Domesday record as a benchmark, tax collectors could compare present claims to pre-conquest values, exposing discrepancies and reducing opportunities for evasion. Norman barons, some of whom had attempted to understate their holdings or escape the liabilities borne by their Anglo-Saxon predecessors, were now pinned to a page. Their dues, like their lands, were documented, delineated, and owed. But the impact of Domesday extended beyond revenue. Feudal service, particularly military obligation, was a central pillar of Norman governance. By recording the names and estates of every tenant-in-chief, and often of their subtenants, the crown now had the information necessary to calculate how many knights each landholder owed under the feudal levy. This made the system of knight service far more enforceable. More strikingly, in August 1086, likely in tandem with the survey's completion, William summoned all landholders, not just barons, but even the undertenants, to Salisbury, where they swore personal oaths of loyalty to him. This unprecedented political move, the so-called Oath of Salisbury, bypassed the normal feudal chain of command, making clear that allegiance was owed first and foremost to the king, not to a mesner lord. Domesday Book, by naming even the lower-tier landholders, made this possible. Moreover, by centralizing the assessment and collection of both taxes and military services, Domesday Book disrupted the economic autonomy of the baronage. Royal revenues increased, baronial slush funds shrank. With more accurate data at its disposal, the crown could squeeze its tenants more efficiently and suppress potential rebellion. A rebellious noble could now be measured not just by rumor, but by his recorded wealth. As one modern historian put it, no one could challenge the king without him already knowing exactly what resources they had to do it. Indeed, William's successors, such as William II, Rufus, and Henry I, leaned heavily on Domesday to monitor potential threats and ensure loyalty. Fiscal information became political power, a tradition that would shape English governance for centuries. Part 6. Consequences and Centralization of Power, Bureaucracy in the Wake of Conquest. Domesday Book stands as a monument not only to administrative genius, but also to the centralization of royal authority in post-conquest England. By documenting every acre of land and every holder, William advanced the principle of allodial sovereignty, that all land in the kingdom ultimately derived from the king, and that even the greatest magnate held title only at his pleasure. In the feudal order, this claim was not new in theory, but Domesday made it real. It brought abstract lordship into the realm of ink, oath, and evidence. The king's power was no longer simply derived from conquest or charisma. It was justified by record, enforced by precedent, and adjudicated by writing. Every noble, priest, and peasant now existed within a network of relationships traceable to the royal ledger. This new reality reshaped the political landscape. Magnates could no longer conceal estates or maneuver between jurisdictions with impunity. The fragmentation of baronial landholding, a deliberate strategy by William, was now codified, and no noble could rival the king's centralized knowledge. Claims, inheritances, disputes, and forfeitures were now all traceable. The Domesday record became a tool of arbitration, reducing the power of local lords to act as law unto themselves. Yet this was not despotism. William's power, though formidable, remained feudal. He ruled through council, relied on bishops and barons, and faced resistance, as the revolts of the 1070s showed. But Domesday made his will far harder to resist. It gave him a foundation for law, for taxation, for military musters, and for adjudicating land claims in ways that were document-based, not merely based on force or custom. Later monarchs would build on this. The 12th century Exchequer developed auditing systems that drew directly on Domesday data. The 100 Rolls of 1279 under Edward I attempted a partial revival of its methods, but none would match its scope until the modern era. In short, Domesday Book did not create an absolute monarchy, but it decisively tilted the balance of power towards the king. It gave rise to a government that knew, and therefore could control, more than any other medieval European monarchy of its time. Part 7. Significance of the Domesday Book, Legacy of Record and Rule. The Domesday Book's significance lies in both its unprecedented ambition and its enduring legacy. For contemporaries, it was a marvel, a testament to Norman order, and a warning that nothing could escape royal scrutiny. Chroniclers recorded with awe that the survey captured not one hide, not one yard of land, not one ox or cow or pig, without it being written down. Its nickname, Domesday, echoed this sense of finality. A book of judgment, where every man's holdings were laid bare, unalterable, eternal. Its administrative influence was immediate. It served as the kingdom's master ledger, a source of fiscal, legal, and feudal truth. It allowed royal justices and tax collectors to operate with authority. It standardized governance, discouraged fraud, and provided the bedrock for the English legal tradition of land tenure, obligation, and documentation. For historians, its value is immeasurable. Domesday Book provides a rare, granular snapshot of 11th century society. Its agrarian economy, feudal structures, and regional disparities. While it was not a full population census, it offers unparalleled insight into the productive and social landscape of Norman England, more so than any document for the next 7 centuries. No similar record exists for France, Germany, or Italy in this period. Not until the Catalogus Baronum of southern Italy, circa 1100, or the 100 Rolls of 1279 in England was anything remotely similar attempted. And even then, those surveys lacked Domesday's breadth, speed, and authority. Only in modern Britain's 19th century censuses do we find a true echo of Domesday's ambition. Yet Domesday's legacy is not merely academic. It is cultural and symbolic. It embodies the Norman vision of governance, centralized, document-based, and unapologetically hierarchical. It links England's past to its present. Today you can visit the National Archives and read the entries, still legible, still binding in their gravity. You can trace the name of your town, your village, your parish, back nearly 1,000 years. It is a living artifact, not of conquest alone, but of governance, law, and identity. In conclusion, the Domesday Book was more than a list. It was a strategy, a message, and a mechanism. Born of military conquest and administrative ingenuity, it redefined how kings could govern. It turned knowledge into command and parchment into power. It is, in every sense, a monument, not of stone, but of scribes, to the enduring legacy of Norman rule.